"Get off county property or I'm calling 911," she screamed, her voice slicing through the quiet like a warning siren. I froze, heart pounding, staring at the papers she waved like weapons, heels digging into the gravel with every furious step. My grandpa's cabin, my family's legacy, suddenly felt like enemy territory. The woman raised her phone like a gun, her eyes wide with authority as if the world would bend to her whim. Sirens began wailing in the distance before I could even think, tension clawing at my chest. Was this really happening? Or had I lost my mind? Would I stand my ground or hand over what's rightfully mine? The morning sunlight spilled over the rolling hills surrounding my grandpa's cabin, painting the valley in shades of gold and green. For as long as I could remember, this place had been a sanctuary, a refuge from the chaos of the world, a home stitched together by family memories and the quiet rhythm of nature. Grandpa had built the cabin decades ago, his hands shaping every beam and every board with care. Growing up, weekends were filled with the smell of pine, the crackle of the fireplace, and laughter echoing across the porch. Even the tiniest details, the way the wind rustled through the old oak tree or the gentle hum of the creek, felt like part of a family legacy. Life here was simple, peaceful, and predictable. The neighborhood was small, mostly quiet families who minded their own business, and for years, we had coexisted without incident. Occasionally, someone might gripe about a fence or a garden gnome, but nothing ever escalated beyond polite conversations over the mailbox. That rhythm, that sense of safety, is what made the cabin more than just a property. It was the heart of our family history. I remember one crisp autumn morning, sipping coffee on the porch when I noticed her for the first time. She was new to the neighborhood, or at least I had never met her. Her house, perfectly manicured and glaringly modern, seemed to radiate a kind of authority, as if every stone and shrub declared her dominance. At first I assumed she was just meticulous, the type who counted blades of grass and labeled every mailbox with military precision. But there was something about the way she glanced at our cabin, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly, that unsettled me. Over the next few weeks, minor signs of tension began to creep in. Notices slipped under our door, warning us about regulations I had never even heard of. A friendly hello in passing carried a sharp edge, her words hinting at rules and boundaries that seemed arbitrary and petty. She would stand at the edge of her yard, clipboard in hand, scrutinizing the way we trimmed the hedges or left our tools on the porch. Her presence alone made the air feel heavier, charged with a tension I couldn't name but instinctively felt. Grandpa, ever the calm and stubborn man, brushed it off at first. "People like that," he said, shaking his head. "They think rules are made for everyone else, not themselves." But even he started noticing the subtle encroachments, the letters referencing non-existent violations, the way neighbors whispered when she passed by, and the increasingly frequent friendly visits she made to our property line. It all seemed small at first, almost laughable, yet there was an underlying message in every interaction. This wasn't just about rules or regulations. It was about control, about asserting dominance where none was needed. Every glance, every word, every scribbled note in the HOA bulletin felt like a piece of a puzzle I didn't want to complete, but was being forced to anyway. Little did I know that this subtle pressure, these minor irritations, would soon escalate into something far bigger than any of us anticipated. The peaceful rhythm of life in the valley, the sanctuary my grandpa had built with his own hands, was on the brink of being challenged. And when it finally erupted, nothing would feel the same again. Not the cabin, not the land, and certainly not our sense of security. That quiet tension, that invisible thread stretching tighter with each passing day, was the calm before the storm. And in the days that followed, I would learn just how far someone could go to make a piece of family history feel like their personal playground, and how fiercely I would have to fight to protect it. It started with the notices. At first, they were harmless, maybe some routine reminders from the HOA, the kind you ignore until a deadline approaches. But soon, the pattern became clear. Each letter was more pointed than the last, demanding explanations for minor things I hadn't even considered, like the angle of the roof over the cabin's porch, or the exact height of the garden fence we'd built decades ago. The rules were nebulous, contradictory, and often downright absurd. One notice claimed our mailbox violated community aesthetic standards. At the same time, another warned that the creek's stone border was too high and distracted from the neighborhood's visual flow. It was as if the HOA had invented a game where the only rule was that we were always wrong. Grandpa grumbled over the first few letters, sliding them across the kitchen table with a scowl. "They're just trying to see how far they can push us," he muttered, hands trembling slightly as he traced the edges of the papers. But it wasn't just the letters. Soon, members of the HOA, or perhaps neighbors acting on their own, started showing up unannounced. One afternoon, I was working on repairs to the old porch when I noticed a car idling at the edge of our property. She was there, clipboard balanced on her knee, phone pressed to her ear, eyes darting to every corner of the cabin like a hawk circling prey. Her presence alone was unnerving. Even before any words were exchanged, there was this silent message: "I am watching, and you are in violation." I tried to brush it off, but then came the phone calls. My cell rang constantly, dozens of voicemails, sometimes as late as 10 p.m., demanding meetings, signatures, or immediate action on violations that I hadn't even been aware of. The tone was always urgent, aggressive, bordering on threatening. Each call left me on edge, stomach knotted, unsure if ignoring it would make things worse, or if responding would only give her more ammunition. Things escalated further when she started targeting the small details of our property, the ones that had been there for generations. She filed complaints about the swing set in the yard, claiming it posed a safety hazard, even though every neighborhood kid had used it safely for decades. She photographed the garden, cataloged the trees, and complained about the shed in the back corner, insisting that its paint was the wrong shade. Each notice came with a warning: pay fines, correct the issue, or face legal action. Fines that, if left unpaid, could accumulate into thousands of dollars. The psychological toll was enormous. Every time I stepped outside, I felt her eyes on me. Every hammer stroke on the porch sounded like a countdown to some invisible tribunal. Grandpa, who had weathered far worse storms in his lifetime, became quieter, more careful with his words, and increasingly anxious. It was clear that this wasn't about rules. It was about exerting control, and she thrived on that power. One evening, I returned from a quick trip to town to find another notice slipped under the door. This one was different. It demanded an immediate meeting with her and 2 other HOA members, warning that failure to appear would result in a formal infraction report and unspecified penalties. My heart raced as I read it. I could feel the cabin's familiar warmth slipping away, replaced by this cold, rigid authority that seemed determined to make us feel like intruders in our own home. The confrontation at the meeting was surreal. She spoke in clipped, rehearsed sentences, as though reading from a script designed to intimidate rather than communicate. Every objection I made was dismissed or twisted into evidence of wrongdoing. The other HOA members sat silently, nodding along, their presence a passive reinforcement of her authority. Grandpa's hand trembled on the armrest of his chair, and I could see the frustration building behind his eyes. When I tried to interject with facts, rules, or historical precedent, she waved them away, insisting that her interpretation of the community standards was final. Days blurred into weeks. Notices piled up on the porch, fines were threatened, and the tension at the cabin grew unbearable. I began documenting everything: photographs, phone calls, written records, aware that something bigger was brewing. Every interaction, every letter, every stare from across the property line felt like pieces in a puzzle I was forced to assemble under duress. Then came the first direct harassment. One morning, as I stepped outside to check the mailbox, I found her standing near the driveway, arms crossed, phone in hand, glaring as if I had committed some unspeakable crime. Before I could say a word, she started rattling off alleged violations, waving the phone and documents around with increasing aggression. It wasn't just the accusations. It was the performative authority. the way she treated the situation like a personal vendetta. That was the moment I realized the conflict was no longer about compliance or rules. It was about dominance. I thought it couldn't get any worse. But the next week, when I returned from a short trip, I found not just a notice, but a team of surveyors from the HOA standing at the edge of the property, measuring, photographing, and taking notes as if the land itself was under criminal investigation. My haven, the place where our family had celebrated generations of birthdays, anniversaries, and quiet Sunday mornings, now felt like a battlefield. And as I watched them, clipboard in hand and camera flashing, a sickening realization hit me. This was far from over. Something was coming, and it was about to escalate beyond anything I could have imagined. The following days were a blur of confrontation, negotiation, and growing paranoia. Each interaction with her felt like stepping into a minefield. If I moved a tool out of place, if I trimmed a bush incorrectly, if a single mailbox flag was misaligned, another notice would appear, threatening fines or legal action. Even routine chores became anxiety exercises. Grandpa, who had always taken pride in maintaining the cabin himself, now questioned every move, fearful that some innocent act might trigger yet another round of harassment. The neighborhood began to feel divided. Some neighbors whispered behind their fences, avoiding confrontation but clearly taking sides. Others seemed emboldened by her presence, adding petty complaints of their own. Every minor infraction, real or imagined, was amplified, cataloged, and used as leverage to make us feel isolated and powerless. The tension was palpable, wrapping around the cabin like a heavy fog that refused to lift. One afternoon, she escalated further, calling in a landscaping inspector, who scrutinized the yard, measuring plant heights and checking the alignment of garden beds. I stood on the porch, hands on my hips, trying to keep my temper in check, as he took notes with an unnerving level of detail. When I asked about the reasoning, he repeated her directive. She asked me to ensure compliance. The absurdity was maddening. Our family's property is being treated like evidence in a bureaucratic crime investigation, with no consideration for its context, history, or human connection. Then came the fines. Hundreds of dollars accumulating faster than we could pay, each one tied to vague or manufactured violations. The letters became more aggressive, warning of legal escalation and potential liens on the property. The stress began to take a toll. Sleep was interrupted by anxious dreams of confrontation, of losing the cabin, of being trapped in a nightmare with no resolution. Even small victories, like completing a minor repair or removing a flagged object, were overshadowed by the constant threat of the following notice. In an attempt to push back, I started documenting everything meticulously: timestamps of calls, copies of every letter, photographs of the property, and even recordings of her verbal threats when she appeared unannounced. Yet the more prepared I became, the more audacious her tactics grew. She began calling multiple times a day, sometimes pretending to be friendly, only to follow up with veiled threats or demands for immediate compliance. Each call left me with a tight knot in my stomach, a mix of anger, disbelief, and fear. The tension finally reached a boiling point one evening. I was finishing repairs on the porch when she appeared again, flailing papers and raising her voice so sharply it echoed through the valley. She accused us of violating a new HOA rule I hadn't even heard of, something about property alignment with natural sightlines. The absurdity of the claim was staggering, yet her conviction made it feel like a legitimate threat. The air between us crackled with hostility. Grandpa stepped forward, voice firm yet controlled, warning her not to escalate further. She ignored him, phone raised, and suddenly, the distant wail of sirens filled the air, a preemptive gesture of intimidation that sent a chill down my spine. The culmination of petty rules, fines, and relentless pressure created a tense psychological battlefield. Every day brought a new challenge, a new test of patience, and a constant fear that some minor misstep would give her the leverage she sought. Our once peaceful cabin had become a stage for escalating power plays, and the line between neighborly oversight and harassment had blurred into a dangerous gray zone. And then came the most unnerving moment yet. She began showing up with supporters, neighbors who acted as informal witnesses to our supposed violations, taking photographs and videos of routine activity as if documenting a crime scene. The weight of eyes, both known and hidden, pressed in on us, eroding our sense of safety. Every porch repair, every walk to the mailbox, every casual gesture outside became a potential flashpoint. The psychological pressure built to the point where minor incidents, like leaving tools in the yard or trimming a tree branch, felt monumental. Arguments broke out, voices raised, frustration spilling into the open in ways that threatened to destroy the calm Grandpa had cultivated over decades. We realized that the battle wasn't just about compliance. It was about defending our sense of autonomy, our right to exist on the land we'd cherished for generations. And just when I thought we had reached the peak of absurdity, I received a call that changed everything. The HOA had escalated matters to the county, citing ongoing non-compliance and suggesting that legal enforcement might be necessary. My stomach dropped. The storm that had been brewing in small, insidious ways was now taking on a life of its own. The tension at the cabin had transformed into a looming threat, one that would force us into a confrontation more intense and more personal than anything we had faced before. Every threat, every fine, every intrusion had led to this point. The letters, the phone calls, the surveillance, the petty rule enforcement, it was all building toward a confrontation that would decide not just the fate of the cabin, but our family's right to protect it. And as I stood on the porch that night, the valley was quiet except for the occasional rustle of wind through the trees, and I knew that when the next knock came on the door, nothing would ever be the same. Something was coming, and there was no turning back. The tension had been building for weeks, a slow burn that tightened like a vice around the cabin and our nerves. Every knock at the door, every unfamiliar car on the driveway, every note slipped under the mat carried the weight of expectation and threat. But nothing had prepared me for that morning. The day when the stakes finally erupted into something unignorable, something that made every previous encounter feel like a prelude to a storm. I had stepped outside early, the sun still low over the valley, to check on some repairs to the old porch railing. Grandpa was inside, quietly humming to himself while preparing coffee. It should have been a calm, ordinary morning, but the moment I opened the cabin door, I saw her car parked directly at the edge of the property, a small convoy of vehicles trailing behind. They weren't alone this time. There were 3 others, clipboard-wielding, camera flashing, and wearing expressions that screamed authority disguised as civility. "Good morning," I said, trying to keep my voice even, masking the surge of adrenaline racing through me. Her lips curled into a thin, condescending smile. "We're here to assess ongoing violations. This time, we'll make sure everything is documented properly," she said, her tone dripping with triumph. The choice of words felt deliberate, as if she were announcing the start of a siege rather than a neighborhood inspection. I stood my ground, hands on my hips, scanning the group for the first sign of hesitation. But there was none. They moved with precision, measuring, photographing, and taking notes, as if preparing a dossier on a criminal enterprise rather than a family property. Each flash of the camera felt like a needle in my chest. A stark reminder that our sanctuary was being invaded not by force of law, but by relentless assertion of power. Grandpa appeared behind me, cane in hand, his face set in a rare expression of controlled fury. "I told you," he muttered under his breath, eyes narrowing at the intruders. "People like this think the world is theirs to command." She didn't wait for an invitation. She strode onto the porch, waving papers and pointing at things she claimed were violations. A crooked fence post, a stone edging slightly misaligned, the placement of a bird feeder. Every accusation was punctuated with that same self-satisfied smile. This kind makes it clear she believes victory is already hers. "I'm documenting everything," I said, voice rising despite my attempt to remain calm. "You have no authority to fine us for things that have existed for decades." Her eyes flicked up, cold and sharp. "Authority comes from the rules, and compliance is mandatory. Ignorance of the rules is not a defense." She raised her phone, pressing it against her ear as if preparing to call enforcement on the spot. My pulse quickened. The sirens from a distant county officer seemed to echo her intent, a prelude to escalation that made my stomach churn. I realized then that words alone wouldn't suffice. Every document, every violation notice, every vague threat had been building to this point. A confrontation where the absurdity of her claims collided with the reality of our property. I took a deep breath, centering myself. Grandpa stepped closer, placing a steadying hand on my shoulder. His gaze was firm, almost daring her to cross the invisible line she had already been pushing. And then it happened. I lunged for the clipboard, yanking it out of her hand before she could make another call, shoving it onto the porch railing with a force that rattled the wood. "Enough!" I shouted, letting the adrenaline surge, the fear giving way to righteous anger. "This ends now. You have no right, none, to intimidate us, to invade our property, or to treat our family's home as a game for your ego." Her expression faltered for a split second, a flicker of shock replacing the smugness. But she recovered quickly, pressing her phone harder against her ear. That's when I noticed it. The other vehicles had doors open, cameras pointed, ready to escalate every minor movement into evidence. I realized words wouldn't stop them. I needed leverage, proof that the intimidation couldn't continue unchecked. I raised my own phone, recording everything. The gestures, the accusations, the absurdity of it all. Each word she spat, each step she took onto our property was captured. Grandpa joined in, holding his own device, documenting not only the invasion but her demeanor, aggressive, theatrical, flagrantly ignoring boundaries. The tide had shifted. She could no longer claim ignorance or righteousness. Her actions were now transparent, undeniable. She shouted over the phone, gesturing wildly, insisting that enforcement was imminent. But the cameras, the recording, and our firm stance created a hesitation I hadn't anticipated. The realization hit her slowly. The power she wielded through intimidation was now exposed. The moment felt electric, charged with a mixture of fear, fury, and vindication. Then came the turning point. I calmly stepped forward, phone in hand, voice steady and unwavering. "This isn't harassment or oversight, it's intimidation. And every action you've taken, every violation you've committed, is being recorded. Do you really want this escalating to the county, where it will be reviewed by professionals who understand the law and property rights?" For the first time, I saw her falter. The smile that had seemed permanent cracked. The clipboard, once a symbol of her authority, now looked like a flimsy shield against the documentation of her own actions. The cameras in her convoy hesitated. The team looked to one another, uncertain. The momentum, which had been entirely in her favor for weeks, was shifting. Grandpa stepped forward, voice calm but commanding. "This cabin has been in our family for decades. We will not be intimidated. We will not be bullied. You may think the rules are on your side, but the law and the truth are ours." Her eyes narrowed, a dangerous edge returning. "You can't," she began, but was cut off as I held up the recording. "Everything you've done is being documented. The county will see it all, and so will your neighbors. This ends today." The tension was unbearable, thick enough to touch. Time seemed to slow as the sirens in the distance drew nearer, not in response to her call, but almost as a soundtrack to the storm we had been waiting to confront. She looked around, suddenly aware that the narrative she had been constructing for weeks, the image of authority, control, and dominance, was collapsing in real time. Then she made a critical mistake. She stepped forward aggressively, trying to reclaim control, and that's when Grandpa, without raising his voice, placed himself firmly between her and the cabin. The gesture was unyielding but straightforward. A physical line drawn that mirrored the legal and moral line we had been fighting to defend. It was a quiet act of defiance, yet it spoke louder than any shouting, any documentation, any threats. The air shifted. The team with her hesitated, cameras lowering slightly. She realized that her theatrics, the fines, the notices, the constant harassment, had reached their limit. For the first time, she was visibly uncertain. A predator confronted with its own reflection. Exposed and vulnerable, I seized the moment, calmly but firmly issuing a statement that would leave no ambiguity. "We will not comply with fabricated violations. We will not be intimidated. And if you attempt to cross this boundary again, the authorities will see everything. You will be held accountable for harassment." The silence that followed was electric. The air seemed to hold its breath as the convoy slowly retreated, realizing that the theater of power they had tried to enforce was crumbling under scrutiny and resolve. She stood frozen for a moment, phone in hand, processing the collapse of the control she had wielded so ruthlessly. Then, without another word, she turned and marched back to her car, the slap of her heels echoing like a final, defiant punctuation mark across the valley. Grandpa exhaled slowly, leaning against the porch railing. "It's over, for now," he muttered, eyes scanning the retreating vehicles. Relief mingled with adrenaline, the cabin seeming to breathe with us, reclaiming the sense of sanctuary that had been under siege. I lowered my phone. Knowing that the footage we had captured was more than just evidence, it was a symbol of resistance, a shield against future intimidation. For weeks, we had been pushed to the edge, forced to navigate absurd rules, fines, and personal attacks. But in this climactic confrontation, we had taken back control, asserting both our legal and moral rights in a way that left no doubt. The valley, bathed in the soft light of late morning, seemed to exhale along with us. Yet even in that moment of triumph, I knew this was only one battle. The HOA's ambitions and desire for control were unlikely to vanish entirely. The warning signs were clear, the lessons hard-earned. But in standing our ground, in facing the absurdity and cruelty head-on, we had achieved something far more valuable: clarity, empowerment, and the knowledge that no manufactured authority could take what was rightfully ours. And as I stepped back onto the porch, watching the last of the convoy disappear down the gravel road, I couldn't help but wonder, would this victory be enough to deter her entirely, or was it just the calm before the next storm? The tension that had gripped the cabin for weeks slowly began to lift, like a storm finally passing over the valley. The air, once thick with fear and frustration, felt lighter. Grandpa and I stood on the porch that morning, surveying the property as the sun illuminated the familiar contours of our land: the porch, the creek, the old oak tree, every detail that had been threatened with scrutiny and fines. For the first time in weeks, it felt like our home again, untouched by intimidation and petty control. In the days that followed, the HOA's aggressive efforts began to unravel. The documentation we had gathered, the recordings, photographs, and meticulous notes, proved invaluable. Every accusation they had made, every supposed violation, every fabricated infraction was now recorded in precise, undeniable detail. When we submitted it to the county, along with our formal complaints, it became evident that the so-called rules had been abused as a tool of harassment, rather than genuine community oversight. Legal counsel confirmed what we already knew intuitively: the HOA had overstepped its authority, and their attempts to intimidate us were not just unfounded, but actionable. What was most satisfying, however, was the response from the community. Neighbors who had previously been silent or hesitant began to approach us, many apologetic for doubting the fairness of the HOA. Some admitted they had witnessed our struggle from afar, unsure how to intervene. In contrast, others revealed that they, too, had been quietly suffering under similar pressures. Our confrontation, captured and documented, became a turning point, not just for our family, but for others who had silently endured the petty tyranny of the HOA. The ripple effect was tangible. People who had felt powerless were suddenly emboldened, realizing that standing up with clear evidence and calm resolve could shift the balance of power. Grandpa, ever the stoic figure, began to reclaim his routines. He walked the property each morning, inspecting repairs, tending to the garden, and occasionally chuckling at some of the absurdity we had endured. The cabin, which had once felt like a battlefield, slowly returned to being a place of sanctuary. There was laughter again, echoing through the valley, mingling with the natural sounds of the creek and the wind through the trees. It was a return to normalcy, but with a new layer of resilience. We had endured, documented, and ultimately triumphed, not with anger, but with precision, courage, and patience. The HOA predictably attempted to push back. There were letters, thinly veiled warnings, and hints at future inspections. But this time, their efforts were met with a calm, measured response. Every interaction was recorded, every claim challenged, every procedure scrutinized for legitimacy. Their attempts to regain control were systematically dismantled, and gradually they began to retreat, recognizing that their intimidation tactics were no longer effective. The power dynamic had shifted, and we were now firmly in control of our narrative and our property. One of the most striking moments came during a neighborhood meeting a few weeks later. Members of the HOA attempted to present a case against us, citing the same issues they had previously used to harass and intimidate us. But the room, now aware of our documented evidence, reacted differently. Conversations that had once been dominated by authority and fear were now filled with questions, skepticism, and demand for proof. The irony was palpable. The same community that had once allowed unchecked power to flourish was now demanding accountability. It was a profound moment of vindication, demonstrating that transparency and truth could dismantle even the most entrenched attempts at control. Beyond the immediate victory, there were long-term consequences that reshaped our approach to property, community, and personal boundaries. We invested in additional security measures, not out of paranoia, but to ensure that our property remained protected and that any future interactions could be documented with precision. Cameras, secure storage for essential documents, and a systematic record of communications became standard practice. It wasn't about living in fear. It was about empowerment, creating a framework that ensured fairness and accountability. Emotionally, the ordeal strengthened us. Facing repeated harassment had forced us to confront our limits, to discover patience and resolve we hadn't fully appreciated. Grandpa, whose lifetime of experience had taught him resilience, found renewed pride in the way we navigated the conflict. For me, it was a lesson in strategy, patience, and the importance of standing firm while gathering undeniable evidence. We learned that confrontation, when approached with clarity and documentation, could neutralize even the most aggressive adversary. The experience also left a lasting mark on the community culture. Neighbors became more vigilant, more willing to question arbitrary rules, and more supportive of each other. Conversations shifted from passive complaints to active strategies for ensuring fairness and transparency in the HOA's operations. What had once been a source of tension now became an opportunity for collective awareness and empowerment. The ripple effect was subtle but undeniable. A community learning to stand together, to protect what was theirs, and to hold authority accountable. Perhaps the most powerful takeaway was realizing the absurdity of the conflict itself. The rules she had tried to enforce, the fines, the invasive inspections, were all minor in the grand scheme of life. Yet they were leveraged as tools of fear and dominance. Understanding this and responding not with panic but with strategic resolve turned the situation from one of helplessness to one of control. What had been a psychological siege transformed into a testament of endurance, a story of reclaiming agency in the face of relentless pressure. As the weeks turned into months, life at the cabin slowly returned to a rhythm that felt right again. Mornings were peaceful, punctuated by the familiar sounds of birds and the creek. Grandpa resumed his woodworking projects, repairing old furniture and tending to the garden with meticulous care. I returned to my routines with a renewed sense of confidence and vigilance. The cabin was no longer just a home. It was a symbol of resilience, a reminder of what could be accomplished through steadfast determination and thoughtful action. We even found humor in the memory of the ordeal, the absurdity of her accusations. The crooked fence post, the bird feeder alignment, the mailbox height became stories we laughed about quietly over coffee. The tension transformed into shared amusement. Humor, combined with the knowledge that we had prevailed, helped heal the emotional toll that weeks of harassment had taken. The cabin, once a stage for conflict, had become a testament to endurance and family legacy. Looking back, the most significant change wasn't in the property itself, but in the mindset we had cultivated. We learned the importance of preparation, the power of evidence, and the necessity of asserting boundaries firmly but calmly. The cabin's walls, once threatened by arbitrary authority, now stood as a sanctuary reinforced not just by beams and nails, but by confidence, knowledge, and resilience. And yet, the experience left lingering questions for reflection, questions that reached beyond the immediate conflict. How many others had silently endured similar harassment, unsure how to fight back? How often is authority misused when no one is watching? And what responsibility do we have to protect ourselves and our communities? Standing on the porch, watching the sun set over the valley, I realized that victory is not just about reclaiming what's yours. It's about learning from the struggle, building safeguards, and inspiring others to do the same. In the end, the cabin remained ours, intact and unharmed, a testament to perseverance and courage. The HOA had been confronted, their power diminished, their tactics exposed, and our family had emerged stronger and more united than ever. Every argument, every notice, every fine, every invasive inspection had contributed to a story of endurance. This story could empower others facing similar conflicts. Our final step was ensuring that the lessons learned would not be lost. We shared our experience with the county, neighbors, and community forums, emphasizing the importance of documentation, transparency, and standing firm. What had begun as an isolated struggle became part of a larger conversation about property rights, HOA overreach, and the balance between authority and personal freedom. The impact extended far beyond the valley, shaping how others approached similar challenges, armed with knowledge and courage rather than fear and submission. And as the evening settled over the cabin, the golden light casting long shadows across the porch and creek, I felt a profound sense of closure. The battle had been hard, exhausting, and at times demoralizing, but it was also transformative. We had protected our legacy, reaffirmed our boundaries, and discovered reserves of patience, courage, and strategic thinking we hadn't fully realized existed. The final takeaway, the lesson I hoped viewers would carry with them, was simple yet powerful. Challenges, no matter how absurd or overwhelming, can be faced with clarity, preparation, and resolve. Authority may overreach, rules may be twisted, and intimidation may be attempted, but standing firm, documenting carefully, and acting strategically can reclaim control and restore balance. And in that quiet valley, the cabin finally felt like home again, unchallenged, secure, and a symbol of resilience that would endure for generations. The question lingered, a subtle nudge to anyone watching. If faced with an overwhelming force that threatens your home or your peace, would you stand your ground or let fear dictate your actions? The answer, we learned, can change everything.